Hello. So today we're going to move on with some of our ecology notes. We talked about the relationship that organisms have with each other, those symbiotic relationships and the three different types. And we said ecology overall is that study of the relationship of organisms with both other organisms, but also with their environment. And we talked about that environment includes the living and non-living components, those biotic and abiotic factors that we discussed. When we talk about levels of organization in ecology, we go from the most broad down to the simplest. The most broad level of organization is something we call the biosphere. So the biosphere, bio, remember, means living. In this sphere that we live on is the earth, and the biosphere is just that thin layer of earth that supports life. And we could think of it like the skin on an apple. If the whole earth was represented as an apple, using that as a model, then just the very thin outer skin of that apple would be the only area where life actually existed. So most of Earth, if we go very, deeper into the Earth, there's no life there. And if we go very high up into the atmosphere, there's also no life. So life really just exists on the surface, a little bit below the surface, and a little bit above the surface. So we would say about 6 miles above the Earth's surface and then to the deepest part of the ocean, and not really much beyond that. So that's the biosphere. The biosphere is broken down into different ecosystems. An ecosystem can be very large or very small. Ecosystem, all living and non-living things in a particular place. So we might say a very small ecosystem might be a lake. So all of the things that live in the lake, all of the vegetation and the fish and the insects and the frogs and all of those things, but also the non-living things, the rocks, the soil, the water, the gases that are dissolved in that, and so on and so forth. So that would be one ecosystem. Ecosystems can be broken down into communities, which make up, so there might be several different communities in a lake. For example, the community along the shoreline might be different than the community in the very deep part of the lake. And of course, communities from one lake to another are also different. But if we break down an ecosystem, there's lots of communities, and communities include, again, all the living things in that particular place. And then within each community, there are several different species that live there, and there are different populations of species. So a population is all of one species that live in a particular area. So of course, if we look at something like Dower Lake, we might say, oh, there's sunfish in there. That's one, there's a population of sunfish, but there's also a population of crappies and population of probably frogs and so on and so forth. So there's lots of different populations that live in that particular community. And then the very simplest level of organization would be an organism. So we might be talking about one fish or one frog as that organism. And then just to go on with some of the key themes in ecology, and I think we maybe mentioned this when I was there last, the interconnectedness. So no organism lives completely by themselves without interacting with other organisms and other non-living parts as well. So we talk in ecology about that interconnectedness and balance and the impact that disturbances have in ecosystems. So one type of disturbance we kind of hear a lot about in these days is introduction of non-native species or new species into an ecosystem, and kind of what that does to a particular ecosystem. So how does that affect the ecosystem, and what does that do? And we know, as we go forward and talk about niches, which is kind of next on the agenda, that of course it has an impact. Every time you bring someone new into a particular habitat or a particular area, it's going to compete with the things that are already there. And how much of an impact is that going to have? And sometimes we don't know until it's kind of too late already. So it's kind of represented, this is taken right from, I think, from an Odyssey Ware diagram, where we have this complete, balance of a population here too. So for population numbers, the number of births have to equal the number of deaths in order for populations to remain stable. So changing environmental factors can have an effect on kind of that population and how much can be supported in a particular habitat or ecosystem. Some of the main factors that limit population size would be water and food, of course. So if think of it as kind of that seesaw. If sometimes something has changed, like let's say all of a sudden there's a reduction in the amount of water in an area, all of a sudden the number of original organisms might be too many to be supported by that reduction in water. So we might maybe see increase in deaths and so on, or something has to happen in order for that balance to be restored. Either water returns or there's a reduction in number of organisms because it can only support so many. And when we talk about an organism's habitat, we are talking about the physical area in which an organism lives, but also the things that it might interact with that are there as well. So the climate, for example, how much rainfall, how humid, the temperature, all of that kind of stuff is part of the habitat, as is the topography. Is it hilly or flat or rocky or smooth? Chemistry of the soil. Is it acidic soil, or is it a more alkaline or basic soil? The water, does it have standing water? Does it have moving water? Does it have any water on the surface? Plant and animal life, what all is in that habitat. So when we refer to an organism's habitat and that physical area in which an organism lives, we're taking into account all of these other things. And we always, tend to lean toward the type of plants that make up that are found in a particular habitat really determine what kind of animal life can exist there. The plants are so important in really, determining what can live there by way of animal life. An organism's niche is a species' way of life. So every organism has a specific niche. So, and it includes a lot of things. It includes things like, the food source and, shelter, the range of conditions tolerated, the number of offspring how many babies it has and how often, the reproductive cycle, what time of year does breeding occur and what time of year are the young born and so on, the type of day that it's active. So many things beyond what it will eat and where it will live. But it has, when we talk about range of conditions, of course, we're talking about what temperatures can an organism survive in. And then you don't have to write down fundamental niche and realized niche. I don't care about those. I do want you to write down what a generalist is and what a specialist is, just because when we talk about the range of conditions that an organism can occupy, some organisms have a really, really narrow niche, if you will. Like maybe they only eat like one type of food or a couple types of food, and they're very, very, very selective. Maybe they need super specific areas where they can nest or birth their young. Maybe conditions have to be just right. And so we would say that would be a specialist. Generalist, much more open, much more accepting of changing conditions. They usually can, especially when we talk about food, they can eat a lot of different things. So examples of generalists we think of, well, humans can eat a lot of different kinds of food, but bear will eat. For those of you who've ever gone bear hunting, you can put a lot of different kinds of food out in bear bait. Bacon grease and old donuts and fruit and just really a lot of different kinds of things. And the bear, of course, will eat all of those things. Raccoons, that's why raccoons and bears both love to dig in garbage, because they'll eat just about anything. They're not very specialized in their diet. Other things, however, remember we talked about the hummingbird that only eats the nectar from one particular kind of flower. But hummingbirds in general, right? They're nectar feeders. It's not like they can go eat a whole bunch of other stuff to survive. If there's no nectar around, uh, they really kind of depend on that. So that would be an example of a specialist. They really just kind of like that one particular food. We also say that no two organisms can have exactly the same niche, meaning they cannot eat exactly the same food, live in exactly the same area, eat at the same time of day, have the same nesting requirements, all of those things, because they'll become in such strong competition with each other that eventually one of them will outcompete the other and one of the species will not survive in that particular area. So each species niche is very specific to that species. And there is a lot of overlap. Like, for example, in Minnesota, in this area, we have several different types of squirrels. We have gray squirrels, red squirrels, we have fox squirrels, we even have flying squirrels. And they do overlap in their habitats, but they all have, some of them feed at different times of day. They can utilize at least some different food sources that other types of squirrels can't. And so there's enough variation so that they all seem to be able to survive okay. And then we're going to do a lab very soon using goldfish, possibly tomorrow. And so I want to talk just a little bit about responses to a changing environment and kind of what happens. So all organisms have something called a tolerance for certain conditions. So they definitely respond to changes in an environment. But all organisms have certain limits that they can exist in, whether it's a certain range of temperature or a certain range of pH or so on. With fish, sometimes it's certain oxygen levels, and it's different for different fish. They're all very specific. So this little graph kind of shows something called a tolerance curve. So we see, so if on the y-axis, which represents the population of a particular organism, so I might have a population of organisms that maybe their ideal temperature range to exist at is right between this, 65 and 70 degree. And if we start to get much below that, we see levels of stress that are hard on the organism. And if we get much over that temperature, we might see levels of stress where it's hard for the animal or organism to live in. Now, we do see a certain amount of acclimation. So sometimes organisms can adjust, to a certain degree, can adjust their tolerance levels to new abiotic factors like temperature. And we can too. Like, there's certain things that happen in our bodies when we get a little bit too cold or a little bit too warm. We either start shivering to try to generate some heat if we get too cold, or we start sweating, perspiring in an attempt to cool ourselves down. So those are ways that we kind of respond to stresses in those environments. Don't confuse acclimation with evolution. Individuals do not evolve. Individuals can only acclimate, and some animals are better at it than others. Evolution is when certain traits are favored, and then we see this change in a population over many generations, but we don't have, evolution and acclimation are very different. Don't confuse the two.